The first thing Klaus Werner noticed wasn't the barbed wire or the guard towers. It was the check, August 1943, somewhere outside Billings, Montana. The army clerk slid a piece of paper across the wooden table inside the processing tent. 80 cents, the man said in clipped English, for 1 day's work. Klaus stared at the voucher, his hands still bearing dirt from the sugar beet fields. The weight of it felt impossible. In the Africa Corps, they'd told him Americans worked their prisoners to death, starved them, beat them, made them dig their own graves before sunrise. Yet here he stood, 22 years old, captured 3 months earlier in Tunisia, holding payment for his labour. Real payment, not worthless scrip, not empty promises, actual money he could spend. The other prisoners around him whispered in German, their voices sharp with disbelief. "It has to be a trick," someone muttered. "They'll take it back tomorrow." But the clerk just stamped another voucher and moved to the next man in line. No ceremony, no explanation, just the systematic processing of enemy soldiers being compensated for their work like any other labourer in America. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Klaus tucked the voucher into his pocket and walked out into the Montana afternoon, where the late summer sun painted the Beartooth Mountains gold against an endless sky. He'd survived Kasserine Pass. He'd survived the voyage across the Atlantic in the belly of a Liberty ship. He'd survived the train ride from New York to this windswept prairie where sugar beets grew in rows that stretched to the horizon. But this small piece of paper worth 80 cents, this threatened to undo every certainty the Reich had drilled into him since he was 17 years old. The propaganda films had been very specific. Klaus remembered them clearly, shown in the mess tent outside Tunis during the spring of 1943, while the Allies tightened their noose around the German and Italian forces in North Africa. An officer with a chest full of medals had stood before the assembled men and told them what to expect if captured. "The Americans are barbarians," he'd said, his voice carrying over the rumble of distant artillery. "They will work you until you collapse, then work you harder. They will starve you, torture you, use you as slave labor to build their war machine. Better to die fighting than to surrender to such a fate." Klaus had believed every word. Why wouldn't he? The officer wore the Iron Cross. He'd fought in Poland, in France, in the first campaigns in Russia. He knew war. He knew the enemy, or so Klaus had thought. Then came the morning of May 8, 1943. The British tanks rolled through their position near Bizerte with mechanical precision. Klaus's unit, already decimated by weeks of constant bombardment, barely fired a shot. Their ammunition was nearly gone. Their food supplies had dwindled to nothing. Men were eating grass, boiling leather, drinking water so brackish it made them sick. When the order came to surrender, Klaus dropped his rifle and raised his hands, expecting a bullet. Instead, a British sergeant handed him a canteen. "Drink slow," the man said in broken German. "You'll make yourself sick." The British held them for 6 weeks in a camp outside Tunis. Then came the ships. Thousands of German prisoners loaded onto American Liberty ships for the journey across the Atlantic. Klaus spent 21 days in the hold of one such vessel, packed shoulder to shoulder with other captured soldiers. The fear was constant. Every creak of the hull, every distant sound that might be a submarine, sent terror rippling through the cramped space. Some men prayed, others went silent, staring at nothing. Klaus tried to remember his home in Bavaria, his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking, the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, anything to push away the certainty that he would die before reaching America. But he didn't die. On June 17, 1943, the ship docked in New York Harbor. Klaus climbed onto American soil, expecting chains, beatings, the cruelty promised by his officers. What he got was a medical examination, a hot shower, clean clothes that didn't smell like death and diesel fuel, food, real food. Not much, but more than he'd eaten in the last 3 months combined. Bread, soup, coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of burnt grain. An American sergeant walked through the processing center, clipboard in hand, calling out destinations. Some men went to camps in the south, others to the Midwest. Klaus and 47 others from his unit were assigned to Montana. Sugar beets, the sergeant explained. Critical war crop. You'll work the harvest. The train ride took 4 days. Klaus pressed his face to the window and watched America scroll past in endless variation. Cities that showed no signs of bombing, farms thick with crops, factories running at full capacity, smoke rising, from their stacks in testament to industrial might. Everything the Reich had told them about America, about its weakness, its decadence, its inability to sustain a war effort, dissolved with every mile of track. By the time they reached Montana, Klaus understood that Germany had lost, not just the battle in Tunisia, not just the campaign in North Africa, the entire war. They'd lost it before it even began, lost it to a nation that could feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers, lost it to a people who built camps with running water and libraries and sports fields for men who'd spent the last 3 years trying to kill them. The camp near Billings sat adjacent to the Great Western Sugar Company factory on the south side of town. Guard towers rose at each corner of the compound, searchlights sweeping the perimeter after dark. Barbed wire surrounded the entire facility, 2 rows of it, the space between patrolled by guards with rifles and dogs. It looked like a prison, because it was a prison. But it was unlike any prison Klaus had ever imagined. The barracks were solid structures, not tents or crude sheds. Each man had a cot, a footlocker, a blanket. The latrine facilities actually worked. There was a mess hall that served 3 meals a day. Not gourmet food, not the abundance Klaus had glimpsed in American towns during the train ride, but adequate. More than adequate. More food than he'd seen in the last year of fighting. The first full day at camp, an American officer assembled the prisoners in the yard. His name was Lieutenant Morrison, and he spoke German with a thick accent that suggested he'd learned it in school rather than from native speakers. "You are prisoners of war," Morrison began. "That status comes with certain obligations and certain rights under the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will obey orders, you will not attempt to escape. In return, you will be treated humanely. You will be fed. You will be paid for your labor." The murmur that rippled through the assembled prisoners was immediate and suspicious. "Paid?" Klaus heard someone behind him whisper. "It's a lie. It has to be." But Morrison continued, apparently expecting the reaction. The United States government will pay you 80 cents per day for work performed. This payment will be made in canteen vouchers, which can be used to purchase personal items at the camp store. 80 cents. Klaus did the math quickly in his head. That was more than some German soldiers earned for a full day's work back home. It was certainly more than prisoners in German camps received, which was nothing, 0. Slave labor, pure and simple. "You will work no more than 8 hours per day," Morrison continued, "excluding breaks, meals, and transportation time. You will be accompanied by armed guards at all times while outside the camp. Local civilians are not authorized to speak with you. Any violation of these rules will result in disciplinary action." The officer paused, his gaze sweeping across the sea of gaunt faces. "I know many of you have been told lies about what to expect in America. You've been told we're monsters, that we'll work you to death or torture you." He shook his head. "We're not monsters. We're soldiers doing our duty, just like you were. The war took both our countries to hell, but it doesn't have to take our humanity with it." With that, Morrison dismissed them. Klaus walked back to his barracks in silence, his mind spinning. Around him, other prisoners argued in low voices. Some insisted it was propaganda, a trick to make them compliant before the real cruelty began. Others pointed out the obvious. If the Americans wanted to work them to death, why bother feeding them so well? Why provide medical care? Why build camps with such attention to basic comfort? That night, Klaus lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling. Through the window, he could see the guard tower silhouetted against the Montana sky, vast and dark and filled with more stars than he'd ever seen in his life. In Bavaria, you could count the stars on a clear night. Here, they were infinite. For the first time since Tunisia, since the surrender, since the moment his world collapsed into chaos and captivity, Klaus allowed himself to think about the future, not the distant future. Not the question of when or if he'd ever see home again. Just the immediate future. Tomorrow, the work that waited in the sugar beet fields, the voucher he'd earn, the strange, impossible reality of being an enemy prisoner treated like a human being instead of an animal. The first morning in the fields came at dawn. Klaus and 39 other prisoners loaded into the back of an army truck, guards positioned at the front and rear. The vehicle rumbled out of the camp gate and onto a dirt road that cut through farmland, stretching in every direction. Sugar beets, row after row of them, the broad green leaves rustling in the morning breeze. Klaus had worked his father's farm in Bavaria, knew the rhythm of agricultural labour, the weight of a hoe, the particular ache that came from bending over crops for hours at a time. But he'd never seen anything on this scale. The fields here made his father's modest acreage look like a garden plot. The truck stopped at the edge of a massive field owned by a farmer named Harrison Mitchell. Mitchell was 63 years old, weathered and lean, with hands that showed decades of hard work. He stood waiting as the prisoners climbed down from the truck, his expression unreadable. "Morning," Mitchell said to the guard sergeant. "Morrison tell you what needs doing?" "Yes, sir." "Thinning and weeding." Mitchell nodded. "Beets are coming up good, but they need work. Labour's been hell to find with all the young men overseas. I'm grateful for the help, even if it comes from the other side." The sergeant barked orders in German, and the prisoners formed lines. Each man received a short-handled hoe and a burlap sack. The work was exactly what Klaus expected: back-breaking, repetitive, relentless. The sugar beet plants had to be thinned, excess seedlings removed so the remaining beets had room to grow. The soil was hard, the sun already hot despite the early hour. Klaus worked methodically, falling into the rhythm his father had taught him. Don't fight the work. Become part of it. Find the pattern. Let your body move without thinking. Around him, other prisoners struggled. Some were city boys, factory workers, or clerks who'd never farmed a day in their lives. They swung their hoes awkwardly, missing more weeds than they cut. By mid-morning, several had blisters forming on their soft hands. The guards watched from the shade of the truck, rifles slung loosely. They didn't yell, didn't threaten, just watched with the bored attention of men assigned a duty they found neither exciting nor dangerous. At noon, Mitchell appeared with his truck loaded with water barrels and a box of sandwiches. The sergeant called a halt to the work, and the prisoners gathered in the shade of a small shelter belt of cottonwood trees at the field's edge. "Lunch is 30 minutes, the sergeant announced. "Drink water, rest." Mitchell's provided food. The sandwiches were simple: bread, cheese, some kind of preserved meat, but to men who remembered the starvation rations of the Africa Corps, they might as well have been banquet fare. Klaus ate slowly, savouring each bite, watching Mitchell from the corner of his eye. The farmer stood near his truck, talking quietly with the sergeant. He didn't look at the prisoners with hatred or fear. Just practical assessment, the way a man might evaluate any group of workers. After 20 minutes, a young prisoner named Otto approached the water barrel for a second cup. As he drank, Mitchell walked over. "You speak English?" Mitchell asked. Otto froze, cup halfway to his mouth. The rules said they weren't supposed to talk to civilians, but Mitchell wasn't threatening, just asking a question. "A little," Otto said carefully. Mitchell nodded. "How's the work?" "Hard, but not impossible." Mitchell smiled. "That's sugar beets for you." He glanced at Otto's hands, raw and blistered. You're not a farmer. Otto shook his head. I worked in a print shop in Hamburg. Mitchell pulled a small tin from his pocket and offered it to Otto. Salve, he said. For the blisters. Use it tonight or your hands'll be useless tomorrow. Otto took the tin hesitantly, as if expecting it to burn. Thank you. Mitchell waved off the gratitude. Can't have workers with ruined hands. Bad for everyone. He walked back to his truck, and Otto returned to the shade, holding the tin like it was gold. Klaus had watched the entire exchange, watched Mitchell's easy manner, watched the absence of cruelty or contempt, watched another small piece of propaganda crumble into dust. The afternoon stretched long and hot. By the time the truck returned to collect them at 5 o'clock, Klaus's back ached and his hands throbbed despite the calluses built from years of farm work. But he'd completed his section of the row, more than his section, actually. He'd helped 2 of the city boys finish theirs when it became clear they were falling behind. At the camp, the prisoners lined up at the processing office. One by one, they received their vouchers. 80 cents. Klaus held his and felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight. The voucher was just paper, but what it represented. Payment for labor, recognition that his work had value, that he, enemy soldier and prisoner, had worth beyond simply being a body to be used and discarded. That night, the camp canteen opened for business. Klaus traded his voucher for a bar of soap, a pack of cigarettes, and a piece of hard candy. The soap was better quality than anything he'd had in the army. The cigarettes were American, strong and harsh. The candy tasted like heaven. He sat on his cot, smoking slowly, letting the nicotine settle his nerves. Around him, other prisoners engaged in the same small ritual, trading vouchers for luxuries, goods they'd chosen themselves, things that made them feel, even for a moment, like men instead of prisoners. Ernst Schmidt, a tank driver from Klaus's old unit, sat on the next cot, sharpening a pencil he'd bought with his voucher. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I'm writing to my mother. If the censors allow it, maybe she'll get the letter before Christmas. Klaus nodded. Tell her you're alive. Tell her you're being treated well. Ernst looked up. Will she believe it? Klaus thought about that. Thought about the breakfast he'd eaten that morning, the lunch Mitchell had provided, the salve for blisters, the voucher in his pocket. I don't know, Klaus said finally. But it's the truth. That night, Klaus slept better than he had in months. The nightmares that usually came, visions of burning tanks and screaming men, and the moment his world exploded into chaos, stayed away. In their place was something quieter. Not hope, exactly. Hope felt too big, too dangerous. But possibility, the idea that maybe, just maybe, he might survive this war with his humanity intact. By mid-September 1943, the work had settled into routine. Each morning before dawn, the trucks carried prisoners to various farms around Billings. Klaus usually went to Mitchell's place, along with a rotating crew of 20 to 30 men. Others went to fields near Hardin or Ballantine, or up to the camp at Fort Shaw, where another few hundred prisoners worked the harvest in the Bitterroot Valley. The sugar beet harvest was critical to the war effort, though not in the way Klaus had initially understood. The sugar wasn't just for food. It was converted to industrial alcohol, used in munitions and synthetic rubber. Every time a 16-inch gun fired, someone had told him 1/5 of an acre of sugar beets went up in smoke. Klaus found grim irony in that. He was a prisoner of war, captured while fighting for Germany, now working to provide materials that would help America defeat his homeland. Yet he couldn't bring himself to sabotage the work, not because of fear of punishment, though that existed, but because Mitchell treated him fairly, because the guards didn't abuse their power, because refusing to work felt like a betrayal of the small dignity they'd been granted. Otto, the printer from Hamburg, wrestled with the same contradiction. One evening in the barracks, he voiced what many of them felt but few admitted aloud. "We're helping them win the war," he said quietly. "Every beet we harvest is a bullet aimed at Germany. An older prisoner named Wilhelm, a career soldier who'd fought in the First War before serving in the Second, shook his head. "The war's already lost," he said. "Germany lost it when it declared war on America. Anyone with eyes can see that." Otto wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. "Wilhelm," continued, his voice weary, "the question isn't whether we're helping them win. They'll win regardless. The question is whether we survive with our humanity intact, and the only way to do that is to work, to earn our keep, to prove we're men, not animals." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Klaus lay on his cot, listening. Wilhelm was right. In the Afrika Korps, Klaus had seen what war did to men who lost their humanity. The casual cruelty, the indifference to suffering, the transformation of human beings into something less. Here, in this strange prison camp in Montana, he was being offered a different path. Work with dignity, fair payment, treatment that acknowledged his worth as a human being despite wearing an enemy's uniform. It wasn't freedom. It would never be freedom. But it was something, and in the fall of 1943, with the war grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, something was more than Klaus had any right to expect. The weather turned cold in October. Morning frost covered the fields, and the prisoners received additional clothing, work jackets, gloves, wool caps. The provisions came without comment or ceremony, just practical acknowledgement that men working in Montana winters needed protection from the elements. Mitchell's harvest reached its peak in the third week of October. The beets were ready, the weather holding, and every available hand was needed to bring in the crop before the first real snow. Klaus worked alongside a new prisoner named Hans Decker, a mechanic from Stuttgart who'd been captured in Sicily. Hans was quiet, sullen, still processing the shock of capture and the disorienting reality of American treatment. On the fourth day in the fields, Hans's hoe broke. The wooden handle split clean through, rendered useless. He stood holding the pieces, fear flashing across his face. In the German army, breaking equipment meant punishment, lost rations, extra duty. Sometimes worse. Mitchell saw it happen. He walked over, examined the broken hoe, and nodded. "Wood's old," he said. "Should have replaced these last spring." He walked to his truck and returned with a new hoe. "Here," he said, handing it to Hans. "Try not to hit rocks with this one." Hans took it, still waiting for the punishment that didn't come. Mitchell returned to his truck without another word. That evening, Hans sat on his cot in the barracks, staring at his voucher. 80 cents, same as every other day. No penalty for the broken hoe, no reduction in pay, no punishment at all. "I don't understand these people," he said aloud to no one in particular. Klaus, lying nearby, understood perfectly. That was the point, to confuse them, to undermine every certainty they'd built about the enemy, to prove through relentless, mundane decency that everything they'd been taught was a lie. It was more devastating than any beating could have been. November brought the first snow and the conclusion of the harvest. Mitchell's fields were clear, the sugar beets processed at the factory, another year's crop successfully brought in despite the war's disruption to normal labour patterns. On the last day of work at Mitchell's farm, the farmer did something unexpected. He brought out coffee, real coffee, hot and fresh, served in tin cups to all 40 prisoners on the crew. The guards watched, but didn't object. It was coffee, not a weapon, not a tool for escape, just a gesture. The prisoners stood in a loose circle near the truck, drinking coffee, watching the sun set over fields that no longer needed their labour. Mitchell addressed them in his limited German, words clearly rehearsed. "You worked hard," he said. "Good work. I'm grateful." Klaus found himself stepping forward before he'd consciously decided to move. "Thank you," he said in English, "for treating us like men." Mitchell looked at him for a long moment. "War's hard enough without losing yourself to it," he said finally. Then he climbed into his truck and drove away. That night, the camp received news from Europe. The Allies had bombed Berlin again. Hamburg was burning. The Russian front had collapsed in several sectors. Germany was being squeezed from all sides, ground down by the overwhelming industrial and military might of nations it had foolishly challenged. Some prisoners wept, others sat in stunned silence. A few maintained stubborn faith that the Reich would somehow turn things around, though that faith sounded more hollow with each passing week. Klaus wrote a letter home that night. He didn't know if it would reach his mother. Mail from America to Germany was uncertain at best, subject to months of delay and military censorship on both sides. But he wrote anyway. Dear Mama, I am alive. I am in a place called Montana, which is in America. I work on a farm, harvesting sugar beets. The Americans treat me fairly. I am fed. I am paid for my labor. I am safe. Please do not worry. I know the news from home must be terrible. I know the war goes badly. But I am safe here, and I think of you and Papa and Maria every day. I hope this letter reaches you. I hope you are safe. I hope we will see each other again when this madness finally ends. Your loving son, Klaus. He sealed the letter and left it in the box for outgoing mail. He had no idea it would take 7 months to reach Bavaria, arriving in May of 1944, just as the Allies prepared to storm the beaches of Normandy. He had no idea his mother would cry when she read it, relief washing over her like rain after years of drought. He had no idea how many times she would reread those simple words, proof that her son had survived the war's chaos. But that night in Montana, Klaus felt lighter. He'd done what he could, reached across the ocean with words, maintained connection in the face of forces trying to tear the world apart. It was enough. December came, and with it a surprise that stunned the entire camp. Christmas packages from the Red Cross. Boxes containing items the prisoners had almost forgotten existed. Chocolate, cookies, playing cards, books, small luxuries that transformed the barracks from prisons into something almost resembling normalcy. The camp commander, Colonel Henderson, authorized a Christmas celebration. Nothing elaborate, just an evening where the prisoners could gather, sing carols, and pretend for a few hours that the world wasn't at war. Klaus sat in the camp's recreation hall, converted for the occasion into something resembling a community center. Someone had found a small pine tree and decorated it with paper ornaments. Another prisoner played accordion, working through German Christmas songs that brought tears to more than a few eyes. Otto stood and sang Silent Night in German, his voice rough but earnest. The guards, standing at the perimeter of the room, listened in respectful silence. When Otto finished, one of the guards, a corporal from Minnesota whose grandmother had emigrated from Germany, sang the second verse in English. 2 languages, same song, same longing for peace. It wasn't much. It wouldn't change the war. It wouldn't bring back the dead or rebuild the destroyed cities or undo the years of suffering. But for one evening in Montana, enemies remembered they were human beings first. That night, lying on his cot while snow fell softly outside, Klaus thought about home, about his mother preparing Christmas dinner with whatever scarce ingredients she could find, about his father, too old for military service, trying to keep the farm running with most of the young men gone, about his sister Maria, working in a munitions factory, doing her part for a war effort that was slowly, inexorably failing. And he thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. From the Africa Corps to Tunisia to surrender to imprisonment, to this cold barracks in Montana, where he was paid fair wages for honest work and treated with a dignity that should have been impossible between enemies. He didn't know what would come next. The war would end eventually. Germany would lose. That much was certain. But what then? Would he go home? Would there be a home to return to? Would his family have survived the bombing and the privation and the collapse of everything they'd known? Those questions had no answers. Not tonight. Tonight, there was only snow falling quietly in Montana and the fading sound of carols sung in 2 languages by men who'd been taught to hate each other but were learning, slowly and painfully, a different way. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was the hardest Klaus had known. Not because of the cold, though Montana winters were brutal. Not because of the food, which remained adequate, but because of the waiting. The uncertainty. The slow grind of time with no clear end in sight. Work continued, though less intensively than during the harvest. The prisoners maintained camp facilities, repaired equipment, cleared snow, and did whatever tasks the army deemed necessary and appropriate under Geneva Convention guidelines. The wages remained constant, 80 cents per day for work performed. Klaus saved some of his vouchers, spending only what was necessary. Others spent everything immediately, buying cigarettes and candy and playing cards, anything to make the days pass faster. In February 1944, the camp received news that should have brought joy but instead brought complicated grief. Rome had been liberated by Allied forces. Italy had switched sides. The war in Italy was effectively over. Several hundred Italian prisoners at nearby Fort Missoula were given new status. No longer enemies, cooperative nationals. Some were released to work in the community without guard supervision. The German prisoners watched this development with mixed emotions. Some felt betrayed. Italy had been their ally, and now Italians were eating dinner in Missoula restaurants while Germans remained behind barbed wire. Others recognized it for what it was. Evidence that cooperation, that renouncing the ideologies that had led to war, brought benefits. A preview of what might await them if Germany ever surrendered unconditionally. Klaus fell somewhere in the middle. He couldn't bring himself to condemn Italy for seeking peace, but he also couldn't forget years of propaganda about German superiority, about the weakness of other nations, about the inevitability of Reich victory. Letting go of those beliefs meant confronting how thoroughly he'd been lied to, how completely the regime had manipulated young men like him. It was easier to push those thoughts away and focus on the work. Spring arrived in March, and with it came preparation for the new planting season. Mitchell returned to contract labour, and Klaus found himself back in familiar fields, preparing soil for another sugar beet crop. The work was almost comforting in its familiarity. Mitchell greeted Klaus like an acquaintance, not an enemy. "You made it through winter," he observed. "Some don't handle the Montana. Cold well. I'm from Bavaria," Klaus replied. "Cold is nothing new." Mitchell smiled. Fair enough. The planting work was different from harvesting. Less urgent, more methodical. Klaus fell into the rhythm of it, grateful for the distraction. Other prisoners rotated through various farms. Some worked orchards when fruit season came. Others were assigned to road maintenance or construction projects the army undertook in the area. All received the same 80 cents per day. All were treated according to Geneva Convention standards. And slowly, incrementally, Klaus began to understand something profound. America wasn't winning the war because of superior soldiers or better tactics or divine favor. America was winning because it had built a society where even enemies were treated with basic dignity, where rules applied equally, where fair payment for labor was expected, not exceptional. That foundation, that commitment to principles even under the strain of total war, was the real source of American strength. Germany had built its power on fear, on hatred, on the brutal suppression of anyone deemed unworthy. America had built its power on something entirely different, and Klaus was living proof of which system worked better. June 1944 brought news that changed everything. Allied forces had landed in Normandy, D-Day. The invasion everyone had anticipated and dreaded had finally come. Germany was now fighting a true two-front war, squeezed between the Allies advancing from the west and the Soviets crushing from the east. The prisoners gathered around the radio in the rec hall, listening to reports. Some maintained stubborn faith that German forces would drive the Allies back into the sea. Others recognized the beginning of the end. Klaus felt numb. Somewhere in France, young German soldiers were dying by the thousands, defending a regime that had sent Klaus to rot in African deserts before abandoning him to capture. He should feel something. loyalty, patriotism, rage at the Americans bombing his homeland. But all he felt was weary sadness, wasted lives, wasted years, wasted potential for what his generation could have built if not for the madness of war. That evening, Mitchell drove to the camp. It was unusual. Civilians didn't visit unless business required it, but Mitchell had gotten special permission. He asked to speak with Klaus. They met in a small office, a guard present but standing outside the door rather than hovering. Mitchell carried a newspaper. "My son's in France," Mitchell said without preamble. "Landed on Omaha Beach with the first wave." Klaus didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" was inadequate. "Congratulations felt wrong," Mitchell continued. "I got a telegram yesterday. He's alive. Wounded, but alive. They're shipping him to a hospital in England." Klaus found his voice. "I'm glad he survived." Mitchell nodded. "I thought you should know. I've had you working my land for 9 months now. Seemed right to tell you that the war's not just something happening somewhere else. It's touching all of us." He paused. "But I wanted you to know something else too. My boy, he wrote me from England, said he was captured for 3 days before American lines caught up. Germans held him, treated him decent, gave him water, bandaged his wounds, passed him back when the lines shifted." Mitchell's voice wavered slightly. "So I wanted you to know that when this is over, when you go home, you'll go with my gratitude. Not just for the work, but for being the kind of man who reminds me that most soldiers, on either side, are just trying to survive." Klaus felt something break inside him. Not collapse, not shatter, just a final wall coming down. "Thank you," he managed. Mitchell shook his hand. "Strange war we're in," he said. "Strange time to be alive." Then he left, and Klaus stood alone in the office, holding the memory of a handshake that bridged the chasm of war. The summer of 1944 passed in a blur of work and news. From Europe, Paris liberated, Romania switching sides, the July plot against Hitler failing, proving that even Germans were turning against the regime. Each development brought the end closer. Klaus worked Mitchell's fields through another harvest, earning his 80 cents per day, saving his vouchers, planning for a future that remained uncertain but increasingly probable. Survival. He was going to survive this war. That realization settled over him gradually, like snow accumulating so slowly you don't notice until the ground is covered. He was going to live through it, return home eventually, face whatever remained of the Germany he'd left behind. In September, the camp received new prisoners, men captured in France during the Allied advance. They arrived confused, traumatized, expecting the horrors propaganda had promised. Klaus watched them process through, saw his own journey reflected in their frightened faces. Otto and Wilhelm and several other long-time prisoners made efforts to help the newcomers adjust. Explained the routine, showed them how the voucher system worked, assured them that the food was safe, the guards were fair, the work was hard but honest. Klaus oversaw one new arrival, a teenager named Peter who couldn't be more than 17. The boy had been conscripted in the desperate final months of Germany's defense, given minimal training, and thrown into combat against battle-hardened Allied forces. He'd surrendered within a week, shell-shocked and half-starved. "You're safe now," Klaus told him in German. "They'll treat you fairly here." Peter looked at him with eyes that had seen too much too young. "I don't understand. We're supposed to be the enemy." Klaus thought about how to explain, about Mitchell's fairness, about the 80-cent vouchers, about Christmas carols sung in 2 languages, about the fundamental decency that persisted even in the midst of war. "We are the enemy," Klaus said finally, "but we're also human beings." And America hasn't forgotten that, even if Germany did. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. VE Day, victory in Europe. Klaus was in the fields when the news came. The guard sergeant drove out personally to tell them, his face showing complex emotions, relief, joy, and something else, Maybe recognition that the men he'd guarded for nearly 2 years had served a regime that had committed atrocities the world was only beginning to fully understand. The prisoners were given the rest of the day off, returned to camp, gathered in small groups to process what this meant. The war was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12 and ended in total defeat. Klaus sat on his cot, staring at nothing. Home. He could go home now, eventually, after repatriation was organized, after the Allies determined how to send hundreds of thousands of prisoners back to a Germany that no longer existed as they'd known it. But the reality was more complicated than simple relief. What was he returning to? The latest reports spoke of total destruction. Berlin, a smoking ruin. Munich devastated. Hamburg burned to the ground. Millions dead. Millions more displaced. The social structure shattered. The economy collapsed. Would his family be alive? Would his village still stand? Would there be anything to return to beyond rubble and grief? Otto found him that evening. "Home soon," he said, trying for optimism. Klaus nodded. If there's a home left. They sat in silence, contemplating a future that should have felt like victory but tasted like ashes. The prisoners remained in Montana through the rest of 1945. Repatriation took time. Ships were needed to transport millions of soldiers home, and prisoners ranked low on the priority list. So they worked. Klaus returned to Mitchell's fields for the 1945 harvest, earning his 80 cents per day, watching the sugar beets grow with practiced eyes. Mitchell's son came home in July, walking with a limp from his wounds but alive. Klaus met him once, briefly, a strange encounter between men who'd fought on opposite sides of the same war. The younger Mitchell shook Klaus's hand. "Thank you for helping my father," he said. "Kept the farm running while I was gone." Klaus didn't know how to respond to gratitude from a man he'd once tried to kill, indirectly at least. "The work was necessary," he said finally. Mitchell's son nodded. "Still, thank you." The final word came in November 1945. Klaus and most of the original prisoners from his camp would ship out in December, first to staging areas on the East Coast, then by ship back to Europe, back to Germany, back to whatever remained. The night before departure, Mitchell threw a small gathering at his farm. Nothing official, just the few prisoners who'd worked his land consistently throughout the war, their guards, and Mitchell's family. Simple fare, talking carefully around the complicated emotions. As the evening wound down, Mitchell pulled Klaus aside. "I have something for you," he said. He handed Klaus an envelope. Inside was a letter, written in English, with Mitchell's signature at the bottom. The letter testified to Klaus's character, his work ethic, his conduct during imprisonment. "It's a reference," Mitchell explained, "for if you need work when you get home, or if you ever think about coming back to America. People do that sometimes. Start over in a new place." Klaus stared at the letter, his vision blurring. "Why?" Mitchell shrugged. "Because you're a good worker. Because the war's over and it's time to start building instead of destroying. Because sometimes the best revenge on bad history is to write a better future." Klaus tucked the letter carefully into his pocket. "Thank you," he said, voice rough. "For everything. For treating me like a man when you had every right to treat me like an enemy." Mitchell smiled. "You were both, same as all of us." The ship carrying Klaus and hundreds of other repatriated prisoners left New York Harbor on December 14, 1945. Klaus stood at the rail, watching the Statue of Liberty recede in the distance. He'd arrived in America as a defeated soldier, expecting cruelty and finding fairness. He'd worked Montana fields for 2.5 years, earning wages he'd never expected, treated with dignity he'd been told Americans couldn't possess. And now he was leaving, carrying memories that would reshape his understanding of the world. The voyage took 18 days. Christmas came and went mid-ocean, marked by carols and Red Cross packages, a pale echo of the Christmas 1943 celebration in Montana. On January 1st, 1946, the ship docked in France. From there, trucks and trains carried the prisoners into Germany. What Klaus saw broke something inside him. Cities reduced to rubble, refugees crowding roads with everything they owned on their backs, children with hollow eyes begging for food. The physical destruction was overwhelming, but worse was the spiritual devastation. The Germany he'd left in 1942 no longer existed. In its place was a shattered nation, confronting the full horror of what it had done, what it had become, what it had cost. Klaus made his way to Bavaria, hitching rides on military trucks, walking when no transport was available. The journey took 3 weeks. When he finally reached his village, he found his mother's house still standing, damaged but intact. His mother answered the door, older than he remembered, thinner but alive. She wept when she saw him. His father had died during a bombing raid in 1944. His sister Maria had survived but lost her husband on the Eastern Front. The village had lost 2/3 of its young men, but Klaus was home. In the months that followed, as Germany began its slow reconstruction, Klaus found work. His experience in Montana served him well. He knew agriculture. He knew how to work hard without supervision. He knew the value of fair payment and honest labor. And he carried Mitchell's letter, which opened doors when presented to American occupation authorities who controlled reconstruction efforts. Klaus never forgot Montana, never forgot the 80-cent vouchers that proved his labor had value, never forgot Christmas carols sung in 2 languages, never forgot Mitchell's handshake across the chasm of war. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, Klaus received a letter from America. Mitchell had tracked him down through military channels, wanted to know if Klaus had survived, if he'd found work, if he was well. Klaus wrote back. The correspondence continued for decades. 2 men who should have been eternal enemies instead becoming friends through the shared memory of sugar beet harvests in Montana. And when Klaus's son asked him, years later, what the war had taught him, Klaus told him about the vouchers, about fair wages for honest work, about the power of treating enemies with dignity, about how the strongest nations weren't those that crushed their enemies, but those that remembered their enemies were human beings deserving of basic respect. That lesson, learned in the fields of Montana while the world burned, proved more valuable than any victory. Because while wars end, the choice of how to treat other human beings, that choice echoes forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.